Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. As Khan mentioned, I basically just want to tell the story behind this project that I've had an incredible amount of flattering response to. For those of you who haven't seen it, it basically looks like this, and I'll show you the finished product at the end. It's a musical instrument built from a subway map. If you can imagine, it's like a stringed instrument, but it's performed with the actual MTA schedule data. So the trains run on their own, and you get a visualized 24-hour cycle, and it's built in HTML5, and it's always running live at mta.me. So I wanted to basically just tell you the story behind the making of this, going all the way back. These are my parents. They deserve the most credit because they signed me up for viola lessons in 4th grade, and that's really where I was just interested in stringed instruments from the beginning. I've also always been interested in computer programming. One of the first things I did when I was a teenager was to program in QBasic line by line the soundtrack to Terminator 2, because that's the best program that you can write when you're a teenager. But I think in college, my thesis project was sort of the seed for a lot of the stuff I'm interested in. It was called Sonata for the Unaware, and it's still live at sonatafortheunaware.com. It was built in Flash. And what I did was I filmed subway commuters and train station commuters and turned their position data into music. So if you can imagine an upright bass using the positions as a piano roll on the bottom and a percussion track on the top. And I think looking back on this, it's amazing how much things have changed with the availability of data, comparing then to now. And I'll talk more about that later. The project really started when I bumped into a friend of mine. I was visiting Seattle just randomly, and I bumped into him on the street, and we decided to have a cup of coffee and just talk about what we're doing. He's an amazing programmer as well and does a lot of illustration work. So he told me, we started talking, and an idea arose. He said, I've always wondered what it's like if you could draw lines and then instantly be able to pluck them. Just simply drawing, like doodling on a napkin, and then turned it into a string instrument with the length determining pitch. So I was really intrigued, and in between my regular job at Google, over the weekends I basically started this project, which was named by an internet stranger. He suggested the name after he saw a video called Crayon, which I loved. It came out pretty much as you'd expect. I worked out the physics for how to simply draw a line and grab it in the interactive space and have it feel like a tactile string. One of the interesting things about it as a musician is it's the total opposite way. There's no control over this. It's very difficult to try to make it sound pretty. So melodies just kind of naturally arise from it. So I thought it was really interesting as a composition tool, is just to sort of stumble on these melodies that seem to come out of nowhere. So once I had this, I really had the building blocks for interactive stringed instruments, and I just imagined, what could I do with this next? What can I turn into stringed instruments around us? And after I'd built this, I also realized a big source of inspiration came from this guy, a book I read when I was a kid. This is Harold of Harold and the Purple Crayon. And I think it's incredible that we could still look back at a book that was published in the 50s for how to model the most engaging interactive experience that you can think of was something about, published in a children's book back then. This is another guy that deserves a lot of credit. This is Pythagoras of the famous Pythagorean theorem. In doing research, I traced it back that he was the first one who decided that there might be some mathematical structure behind what we find musically pleasing, which is something we take for granted now, that there's a piano keyboard and that sounds good to our ears. The story goes that he was walking by a blacksmith and heard the sound of his anvil and noticed that some tones just sounded more pleasing to his ear than others, and decided that there must be some sort of fundamental sound mathematics happening under there. And over time, he figured out that if you take a length of string, pull it nice and taut, and pluck it, if you cut that length of string in half, it'll actually go up an octave. And if you cut it in 2/3, it'll go up a fifth. And there are just these perfect mathematical structures that inform what our ears find pleasing. And I think it's incredible because I think stringed instruments are really the closest that we come to experiencing raw waveforms. That sound is just these pulsating waves, pushing through the air. And I think strings, when you think of them, are really the closest that we can come to that. So when I started working on the project, of course, my friend had a large print poster of Massimo Vignelli's famous 1978 subway map. And I immediately decided that this was the map I wanted to use for my project. And it's notorious among designers for being very beautiful, and in doing some research, I also found it was very controversial at the time for having a lack of giving the viewer a geographical sense. But what he really intended was for it to be almost an abstraction and just giving you the point-to-point information that you needed, which I thought was interesting. This is a photo I found on Flickr of it still present day in some subway stations underneath the old map. So I dove in using the string engine that I'd written for Crayon, and I started looking up, does the MTA offer the data? And amazingly, I typed the Google search in MTA developer data, and it was pretty much immediately downloadable. It's nothing mysterious. It looks like this. It's basically a giant Excel sheet with all the, it's the equivalent of what you get from your schedules, and it's basically dumped into text files that you can drag into Word. And over time, I managed to parse it and do a lot of other computer programming work around it, and eventually the sort of aha moment came when I finally got the dots to start moving and slowly crawl. So this is a video capture of the final piece. The way that it works is if you went to it at 4:40 p.m., it would start at 4:40, and it would ask the MTA schedule, hey, have any trains departed recently? And it'll start drawing them along their path. And as you'll see, as they intersect, they sort of play each other's strings. Musicians will note that I decided, I think there's some aesthetic decisions, and one of them was that I wanted it to be a pleasant thing because I think Subway is such an unpleasant experience, so I chose the major scale. I didn't want it to be this dissonant experience. So what happens is it accelerates so that you can get a full 24-hour view of what the subway, the melodies that the subway might create in this virtual world. Some other interesting things that I figured out was that some trains no longer exist. Since the Vignelli map was created, the 3rd Ave L, K-train, things like that no longer exist, so I basically just made up times for it to run, and I think in this world it'll run around midnight, as if they're ghost trains that kind of come out at night. But I was just really flattered by the response to this project. I just moved to New York this past September, and I'm glad to have done something that seems to have struck a chord with so many people in the city, something people are so familiar with. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was just a little extension on this project, which I did a few months after this launched. I decided right now I think we're in a really amazing time where we're getting increasingly interfaceless. With first, I think the iPhone and the iPad we take it for granted. It's amazing that when Steve Jobs first showed the iPhone, we marveled at, and it was like magical, and now it's just sort of, background. But I still am amazed by how we now use ourselves as interfaces. And I think the other places that has taken off is the Microsoft Kinect, which is a 3D camera that detects your movement through space. So for Music Hack Day, this 24-hour event that happens in New York, I got together with 2 strangers, Aiden and Tyler, and decided what could I do in the physical space with this string engine. So I decided it'd be nice to be able to draw strings in the air and literally pluck them with your hands instead of with a mouse. And we got together in 24 hours. We managed to create a project that we called Stringer, which is sort of a skeleton for many upcoming projects. This is the last thing I'm going to show, and I'll just let it run. We thought this would be an interesting prototype for a sidewalk installation, as people can walk by and it might automatically generate melodies, and as they walk by, they unknowingly trigger their own melodies. The really satisfying thing I think about this was it's the closest it's kind of come to the Harold and the Purple Crayon model of interaction, where you're literally drawing things through the air and instantly they come to life magically. Multiple people can play at once. So I've got a lot of other string projects in the works, so definitely come talk to me. Find me on Twitter or my website and drop me an email, and I'll be around all night, so I'd love to meet you and talk to you. Thanks again for having me.